Hello to everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person, but I hope that the presentation, a little bit about the global overview of where we are with the UNESCO recommendation on open science, will be useful for the meeting and for the rest of the discussions. So just to start the presentation, I did want to remind everybody why we promote open science at the United Nations and why we do it in UNESCO in particular. So as you know, the Sustainable Development Goals were set in 2015 with the idea really of galvanizing the global community around these priority areas, around these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, to achieve these goals, science, technology, innovation is key. But what we have seen in the past few years is that to achieve these very complex and interconnected sustainable development goals and to overcome these global challenges also requires science that is more accessible, that is more efficient, more equitable, more transparent, more collaborative and inclusive, and also science that is much more connected to society, the needs in society, and to innovation and sustainable solutions. In this context, also, we have to remind ourselves that the Article 27 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights is an article saying that everyone has the right to freely share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And this particular article and this human right has been particularly relevant in the context of the COVID pandemic. So, here again, the need for open science comes across very strongly as it is one of the possible tools to enact this Article 27 to give rights to freely share in scientific advancement and benefits for all. And then, as I said, the third part and the third big reason for which open science is of particular relevance in UNESCO is that it has the potential of making science and the scientific process more connected to societal needs, more accessible for all. And it can also bridge science, technology, innovation gaps between and within different countries. Now, of course, up to today, we have still unequal access to knowledge. And if only we have a look, we would just have a look at the different publications, we see that in general, some 70% of all scientific publications worldwide are still locked behind some kind of paywalls, which means that for 70% of all the scientific publications, we still need to pay a price to be able to read them. However, we saw that because of the crisis of COVID-19, 85% of COVID-19 related publications are open access. So change is possible in terms of access to knowledge, access to scientific publications. There just needs to be a will and a way to make scientific publications more accessible to broader audience. Again, if we take this number of 85% of COVID-19 related publications, which are open access, and we compare it to, for example, climate change, here we only have some 50% of publications which are open access. So there is need definitely to do more to make sure that not only COVID-19 related publications, but also other important publications which contain knowledge about important and critical issues that humanity is facing are also open access and available for everybody. So it is in this context of inequality to access to knowledge, but also science, technology, and innovation gaps that UNESCO, the UN Agency for Education, Science, and Culture, tasked the organization to provide an international policy and action framework for open science, because there was a very important need for a common definition of open science, a shared set of values and principles. So basically, we saw rising of different open science initiatives across different regions within the last maybe 2 decades or so. But this overall overarching policy framework for open science, internationally agreed, was definitely missing. And for 2 years, from 2019 to 2021, UNESCO led a series of consultative processes to be able to come up with this policy framework in view of a UNESCO recommendation. which was then negotiated and adopted in 2021 at the UNESCO General Conference, where 193 member states adopted this first international standard-setting instrument on open science in the form of the UNESCO recommendation on open science. And a UNESCO recommendation is an important recommendation because, of course, the countries, member states adopt it. They have to report back to UNESCO on the progress made. It's a legal instrument in which the General Conference formulates principles and norms for the international regulation of a certain topic, and in this case it is open science. And even if it's not legally binding, it does have a very strong moral value and does make countries take into considerations what is in the recommendation and apply whatever practices are necessary to be able to put the recommendation in practice and implement it. So just very briefly on how the open science is defined in the recommendation. It is defined as an ensemble of different movements that make scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable for everyone, that increase scientific collaboration and sharing of information, and that opens the process of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication to societal actors beyond the traditional scientific community. So we are talking about opening science to scientists, but also opening science to society. More specifically, the member states and everybody who was involved in the creation of the recommendation agreed with a very broad overview of open science in terms of the different elements of open science. So the key pillars of open science as defined in the UNESCO recommendation is open scientific knowledge, where we talk about open access to scientific publications, open research data, open educational resources, open hardware, open source software, and source code. Then we have open scientific infrastructures, virtual and physical, open engagement of societal actors through initiatives such as citizen science or participatory science, scientific volunteering, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, any type of activities in which societal actors are actually engaged in the production of science and then use of it as well. And then open dialogue with other knowledge systems, including dialogue with knowledge holders such as indigenous peoples, local communities, and of course, marginalized scholars. So again, a very broad definition of open science going well beyond just open access to scientific publications and making the entirety of the scientific process more open and more collaborative, more transparent. Of course, with such a very broad definition of open science, and apart the definition, there is also a series of different actions that member states are invited to undertake in the areas of capacity building, investment in science, in open science, investment in infrastructures, building a culture of open science, aligning the different incentives. So there is a series of different actions that are given in the recommendation, and we do realize that all of these actions, to be able to implement them, the member states basically do need to transform the scientific system as it is right now, and making it in its entirety more open and more transparent and more collaborative. We realize that there are several key challenges in the implementation of open science recommendation, and I understand that this meeting today will also be dedicated to looking into some of these challenges and the ways of overcoming these challenges. And maybe the most important ones really are the need for change in the conventional scientific culture, which still tends to go more towards more closed science than towards more open science. Then, of course, the human and institutional capacity in terms of open science. There is need for capacity building in open science, both for researchers, but also for universities, chancellors, vice chancellors, librarians, many other actors of the open science system. There is need for adequate infrastructures, including reliable internet connectivity, which is actually key for ensuring that open science is indeed equitable and that it closes the science, technology, innovation gaps, and it does not actually makes them even more difficult and more wide. There is need to align incentives and in that sense to revise some of the criteria for evaluation of scientific excellence and scientific careers. So we are talking about possible reforms of research assessments because for the moment, the way researchers are assessed and evaluated is not necessarily in line with the principles of open science. And that definitely needs to change if the researchers would be the ones to really carry forward open science initiatives and actions in line with UNESCO recommendation on open science. And then there is, of course, the need to address some of these unintended negative consequences of open science practices, such as, for example, the ACP's article processing charges, which we see with the rise of open access publishing, and some other unintended negative consequences that need to be highlighted and addressed as well. And again, I believe this meeting will be focusing on some of those as well. So in UNESCO, we really see capacity building, building a policy environment, investing and financing and investing into incentives in a way for open science, infrastructures and monitoring of open science as some key areas for action that are needed in order for open science to be implemented across the world in an equitable way. At the international level, just a very quick overview of what we are doing right now is that we are developing a series of supporting tools, technical briefs, fact sheets, guidelines to help in a way unpack what is in the recommendation, make it understandable for different audiences, and also guide some of the actors in the implementation of the recommendation. Then we are also collecting and mapping existing open science policies and strategies, which is extremely important, particularly as countries are starting to put in place their open science policies and strategies, and they are very, very keen on learning from each other. We are collecting and sharing some best practices. The call for best practices is still open and ongoing, and we would invite everybody to provide inputs into this call for best practices if they are aware of some good practices or diverse practices for open science. We are analyzing open science financing mechanisms and incentives, promoting open science infrastructures, particularly those in UNESCO's field of expertise. We are building capacity, working with different actors in different regions, and in particular in Africa from our side to build capacities for open science. And we are also working on the development of an open science monitoring framework. While we do that, we really rely on different partners and on different actors of open science across the different disciplines and across the different regions of the world. So we have established a global open science partnership with different partners coming on board and helping us with the implementation of the recommendation. We have a steering committee for open science that is steering the work of the organization in terms of implementation of the recommendation. And again, it has equal regional representation and also disciplinary representation as well. And then we have a series of open science working groups, which are really helping us defining and developing these supporting tools that are needed for the different actors that are trying to implement open science recommendation and put in place open science practices. In terms of this toolkit that we are producing, we have recently launched in December some of the first parts of the toolkit, but it's still being developed. We have provided guides for building capacity, developing policies for open science, funding for science, and for bolstering open science infrastructures. As I said, these guides have been produced with the help of the working groups that are open-ended and open for all. And again, I do invite everybody who is interested, if you are not already part of these working groups, to join the working groups because they really do help us define some of the issues and then also address them through different means. We have checklists for universities, open access publishers, and some fact sheets that, something around understanding open science, looking into predatory journals and conferences, some of these issues that really are important when we do try to put in place open science practices in line with the recommendation. We are currently also working on a capacity building index for open science, knowledge sharing platforms, and also an observatory for policy instruments. So we are continuing to work on these different issues. We do very much appreciate inputs from different regions, because that is very important to understand open science in its entirety, because we do realize for open science to really work, it has to work in the same way, let's say, in different regions of the world. So I will stop here for this global overview of the recommendation and what we are doing at the international level. I do invite you again to join the Open Science Partnership, contribute to open science calls, engage in the discussions of the working groups. You can find all the information on our website, or also by contacting us at openscience@unesco.org, or just contacting me personally, or our colleagues in our offices across the world and in the region in particular. So I will stop here, and thank you very much for the invitation, and I wish you successful meeting. Thank you very much.